Hello and welcome dear students. Today we will take up the last session of theme in World History, the three orders of class 11th. The learning objectives of today's session are to help you learn the factors responsible for the crisis of 14th century Europe, to help you understand the consequences of the crisis of 14th century Europe, to help you understand the political changes that occurred in the 15th and 16th century in Europe. Well, students, you will know about the crisis of the 14th century Europe and factors which slowed down the economic expansion in Europe. The crisis of the 14th century. By the early 14th century, Europe's economic expansion slowed down. This was due to three factors. First, in northern Europe, by the end of the 13th century, the warm summers of the previous 300 years had given way to bitterly cold summers. Seasons for growing crops were reduced by a month and it became difficult to grow crops on higher ground. Second, storms and oceanic flooding destroyed many farmsteads, which resulted in less income in taxes for governments. Third, the shortage of pasturage reduced the number of cattle. Population growth was outstripping resources and the immediate result was famine. Severe famines hit Europe between 1315 and 1317, followed in the 1320s by massive cattle deaths. In addition, trade was hit by a severe shortage of metal money because of a shortfall in the output of silver mines in Austria and Serbia. This forced governments to reduce the silver content of the currency and to mix it with cheaper metals. The worst was yet to come as trade expanded in the 13th and 14th centuries. Ships carrying goods from distant countries had started arriving in European ports. Along with the ships came rats carrying the deadly bubonic plague infection, the Black Death. Western Europe, relatively isolated in earlier centuries, was hit by the epidemic between 1347 and 1350. The modern estimate of mortality in that epidemic is that 20% of the people of the whole of Europe died, with some places losing as much as 40% of the population. As trade centers, cities were the hardest hit. In enclosed communities like monasteries and convents, when one individual contracted the plague, it was not long before everyone did. And in almost every case, none survived. The plague took its worst toll among infants, the young and the elderly. There were other relatively minor episodes of plague in the 1360s and 1370s. The population of Europe, 73 million in 1300, stood reduced to 45 million in 1400. Effects of the crisis of the 14th century. This catastrophe, combined with the economic crisis, caused immense social dislocation. Depopulation resulted in a major shortage of labor. Serious imbalances were created between agriculture and manufacture because there were not enough people to engage in both equally. Prices of agricultural goods dropped as there were fewer people to buy. Wage rates increased because the demand for labor, particularly agricultural labor, rose in England by as much as 250% in the aftermath of the Black Death. The surviving labor force could now demand twice their earlier wages. Dear students, now we can analyze the factors responsible for the crisis of 14th century Europe and its consequences also. Now, dear students, we will know about the social unrest caused by the crisis of the 14th century. Social unrest. The income of lords was thus badly hit. It declined as agricultural prices came down and wages of laborers increased. In desperation, they tried to give up the money contracts they had entered into and revive labor services. This was violently opposed by peasants, particularly the better educated and more prosperous ones. In 1323, peasants revolted in Flanders, in 1358 in France, and in 1381 in England. Though these rebellions were ruthlessly crushed, it is significant that they occurred with the most violent intensity in those areas which had experienced the prosperity of the economic expansion. Despite the severe repression, the sheer intensity of peasants' opposition ensured that the old feudal relations could not be reimposed. The money economy was too far advanced to be reversed. Therefore, though the lords succeeded in crushing the revolts, the peasants ensured that the feudal privileges of earlier days could not be reinvented. Dear students, we have seen how the crisis of the 14th century caused social anger and also affected all aspects of life. Now, we will be able to know about the political changes that took place in Europe in the 15th and 16th century. Developments in the political sphere paralleled social processes. In the 15th and 16th centuries, European kings strengthened their military and financial power. The powerful new states they created were as significant for Europe as the economic changes that were occurring. Historians have therefore called these kings the new monarchs. Louis XI in France, Maximilian in Austria, Henry VII in England, and Isabella and Ferdinand in Spain were absolutist rulers who started the process of organizing standing armies, a permanent bureaucracy, and national taxation, and in Spain and Portugal began to play a role in Europe's expansion overseas. The most important reason for the triumph of these monarchies was the social changes which had taken place in the 12th and 13th centuries. The dissolution of the feudal system of lordship and vassalage and the slow rate of economic growth had given the first opportunity to kings to increase their control over their powerful and not so powerful subjects. Rulers dispensed with the system of feudal levies for their armies and introduced professionally trained infantry equipped with guns and siege artillery directly under their control. By increasing taxes, monarchs got enough revenues to support larger armies and thus defended and expanded their frontiers and overcame internal resistance to royal authority. Centralization, however, did not occur without resistance from the aristocracy. A common thread running through all types of opposition to the monarchies was the question of taxation. The nobility managed a tactical shift in order to ensure their survival. From being opponents to the new regimes, they quickly transformed themselves into loyalists. It is for this reason the royal absolutism has been called a modified form of feudalism. The king was no longer at the apex of a pyramid where loyalty had been a matter of personal dependence and trust. He was now at the center of an elaborate courtier society and a network of patron-client relationships. All monarchies, weak or powerful, needed the cooperation of those who could command authority. Patronage became the means of ensuring such cooperation. The later history of France and England was to be shaped by these changes in the power structures. In the reign of the child king Louis XIII of France in 1614, a meeting was held of the French Consultative Assembly known as the Estates General with three houses to represent the three estates or orders, clergy, nobility and the rest. Dear students, now we can analyze the political changes that occurred in the 15th and 16th century Europe. Dear students, here is some creative home assignment for you. First, explain the factors responsible for the crisis of 14th century Europe. Second, what were the consequences of the crisis of 14th century Europe? Third, explain the political changes that occurred in the 15th and 16th century in Europe. With this, we have now come to the end of today's session. I hope you have enjoyed it. Thank you very much.